everyone, great to be here, and it's lovely. I'm actually from Bristol, so it's actually lovely to do an event where I don't have to travel. So it's brilliant. So welcome to Bristol if you're not from Bristol. If you are from Bristol, good choice. So I'm going to talk today about ransomware groups. And I'm going to go into what ransomware is in a minute, but we're going to look at what the criminals actually do, how they actually operate, trying to understand their business model so that we can better protect our organizations as a result. So this was actually said to me by one of my clients who said, okay, just pay them whatever they want when they got hit with ransomware. And what I do professionally when I'm not coming and speaking at these events is I go into organizations and I help them prepare for a cyber attack, planning plans, playbooks, incident response type situations, business continuity, identifying those systems, and working out what they would do if they were attacked. Ransomware, which is what we're going to be focusing on largely today, is one of the biggest problems that we're seeing in cybersecurity. In fact, we're seeing more ransomware attacks this year than we have seen in previous years combined. So it's a growth industry, shall we say, to use business terminology. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to look at who are these ransomware groups, what do they do, how do they operate, and how do they make money as well, because these groups are making absolutely insane quantities of money. We're talking hundreds of millions of pounds every year from victims that they're extorting. So it's really important that we dive into this, and hopefully it will be a slightly comical look at the dark and mysterious world of ransomware groups. So a quick introduction to the world of organized crime. My background actually is in one of the police cybercrime units. I worked there for a while, looking at a lot of the organized crime that was happening in the cyberspace. What we have seen in the last few years is what typically used to happen was these groups would find a piece of malware, have a piece of malware that they would get onto your network, onto your systems. And this piece of malware would essentially encrypt everything that you had, so it would lock you out of your systems. And that was working well for a while, and people were paying the ransom, and the money was going up, and everyone, well, not everyone was happy, all of those people were happy. And then what happened was companies started investing very heavily in backups and backup technology. And all of a sudden, not having access to your systems, well, okay, we'll have to restore from backup. That might take us a little bit of time, but we don't need to pay the ransom because we've got this backup. So the ransomware groups thought, okay, they're not paying the ransom as often as they were, so we need to innovate. So they then started getting into companies' networks, and they'd sit there for a while, see what was going on, and they'd steal a copy of all of your vital data. They'd take that copy. Then they'd encrypt and lock you out of all your systems. And then they'd say, okay, look, you pay the ransom, and what we'll do is we'll unlock all your systems and give them back to you, but we'll also guarantee we won't publish this data. And if you don't pay, we're going to publish this online for everyone to see. And all of a sudden, people started paying ransoms again. And now, as we sit here today, it's about 86% of organizations pay. So the vast majority pay the ransom for this exact reason. They've got your client data, they've got your sensitive business data, and it will be public if you don't pay. They're highly, highly organized businesses, and they're obviously profit and innovation-driven, unfortunately. And we're going to have a little look at a story that sort of happened that gave us really an unprecedented insight into how these groups operate. And this happened on the 24th of February, 2022. And you might recognize this date. This was the date that Russian tanks drove across the border into Ukraine. And all of us sort of thought, oh my God, we didn't think this would happen. A war in Europe. But something else happened on that exact same day. And a ransomware group known as Conti, which was one of the biggest ransomware groups we have ever seen, published this statement. And the Conti team, the high-up people, the C-suite, if you like, of the ransomware group, published this statement saying they are officially announcing a full support of the Russian government. If anybody will decide to organize a cyber attack or any activities against Russia, we will use all our resources to strike back. they published that. Everyone saw it. But they made a massive mistake, because what they failed to realize was that within their group, within their organization, there were Ukrainian hackers. There were hackers in Kazakhstan and other ex-Soviet countries who didn't find this very funny. And so what happened almost straight away afterwards was a Twitter account that's still up called ContiLeaks was created by some of the aggrieved other hackers within the group. And whilst the C-suite pulled this statement down pretty quickly, the damage was already done. And information started pouring out. So these insiders, if you like, a bit like an Edward Snowden situation, but in ransomware groups, had taken copies of all of the data that Conti had. All the internal chats, all the strategy documents, all the pay documents, all the documents about everything else they were doing, all of their operations. They'd taken a copy of it all, and they posted it publicly online for everyone to see. And what that meant for the cybersecurity community was actually quite profound. It meant that for the first time ever, we got to see exactly how organized crime was. And by and large, across the industry, we were pretty horrified at what we saw. We knew that they were run like a business. We knew they were profit-driven. We knew that they were obviously innovating and using that money for R&D and a lot of the things that we do in business. We didn't quite know the extent. And essentially, ransomware groups are almost identical in how they operate to Silicon Valley tech startups. That's what I would liken them to. Exactly the same in terms of how they're run, in terms of how they're thinking about innovating, in terms of profit margins. This is all the discussion that was disclosed in the chat. We also realized that they have job roles very akin to our companies. So these ransomware groups, these organized crime groups, they're not some guy sitting in a basement somewhere with a hoodie on. They've got HR who organize people within the ransomware group. They've got payroll, they've got call centers set up to handle customer or victim concerns and complaints. They have people who are taking a sort of CFO role and a COO role. It's exactly the same as any other corporate structure. So what's on offer? Actually very favorable salaries. They're very, very generous in their pay packages. Lots of it was also commission-based, so depending on how successful an attack was, you got a percentage back of that final ransom that was paid. And they had people all over the world. They had people in Brazil, they had people in the UK, they had people everywhere, because they were actually discussing how important it was to have native Brazilian speakers speaking to a Brazilian victim, and how much more that persuasive that was if you had those people. So they had all of these different people working at different layers of this organization. And they talk to each other. In no point do they use actual real names. We don't actually believe they knew each other's real names at all. But they're talking about what it's like to work in Conti. And Salmon, who is one of the top recruiters in Conti, is talking to someone who's just been hired, who goes by the name of Core, and he's saying, the weekends are the weekends, no one cancels vacations and sick days. They had sick days. There were discussions about how you had to go to a doctor and get a sick note to give to your manager so they could ascertain for sure that you were actually off sick legitimately. They were very protective of their weekends. They were very protective of holidays. You had to put holiday requests in. They had a whole platform for putting holiday requests in so that you could take time away from your organized crime business and relax, I guess. One thing that was quite interesting as well was they actually issued fines for bad behavior. So unlike a normal organization where we might reward good behavior and we have Employee of the Month schemes, they also had Employee of the Month schemes. They would also give fines for bad behavior. So if you were off sick and you hadn't handed in a doctor's note, your salary would be forfeited a certain amount each month. And this is how they conducted business. The other thing that was really interesting was they have recruitment issues, just like we do. And the discussions, if you read through some of the dumped documents, which are still all up and available to read, the discussions they were having was that they actually had a real issue with recruiting and retaining talent. And they were coming up with schemes very similar to how you would see out in the normal world of how they were going to do that. The other issue they had, which is quite funny, was they had a complete lack of diversity. And they were talking about how they really need more women, and we need to recruit more women. We don't have enough women in the business. And they felt that this would be a strong way forward. So they have all the same recruitment issues. Now, you might think that it would all be young males in these groups, right? Potentially, that's what you would think. But it wasn't. And what was perhaps most alarming to the cybersecurity community was in the dump documents, we saw people like this individual, who was calling themselves Patrick, who claims to have been a programmer. He's been working in higher education, and he's worked for other big companies. He was someone who was obviously a cybersecurity professional who was applying to work in this ransomware group, which caused us a lot of alarm. So the other thing that came out with the Conti leaks that was quite interesting was we always believed that they would probably work from home, so to speak, as a ransomware group. But this wasn't the case at all. And in actual fact, this person, Target, who was one of the highest up people in Conti, was actually talking about the office space that they owned as a ransomware group. And they had this office space set up. They were talking about equipment and what they needed. There was loads of documentation about things like providing good chairs for the staff and making sure they had sufficient equipment to prevent repetitive strain injuries and occupational health concerns that they had for the hackers that were hacking victims around the world and causing all this disaster. So they had office space. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that these attackers aren't afraid that they're going to get caught. Because criminals openly hiring office space full of hackers and people all around the world, they're not afraid that the police are coming to knock on their door anytime soon. Which tells you a lot about the way cybersecurity has gone, in my opinion. So that was Conti. But this year alone, these are just a handful, tiny handful of large organizations that have been hit with ransomware. And as you can see, it's completely international. We've got huge companies from like Capita and Ferrari, all the way to companies in Japan, South America, Africa. It's literally across the board. Every single country is having this exact same problem, this exact same issue. And I've spoken around the world and advised around the world on ransomware preparedness, and it's the same concern spread in every single country. So they're really successful. And the one thing we've noticed with ransomware groups, and there's a number of them. Conti was one. They have since, I suppose you'd say, gone bankrupt or gone into administration. They were one, but there's loads of others. And what we've seen in the last few years is something quite interesting. So ransomware groups typically were obviously seen as this sort of aggressive tiger kind of criminal gang, I suppose, who were coming after you, which is probably a correct identification of them as an industry. But they realized that actually they're missing a trick here if they want insurance companies to pay them if a company gets hit, or if they want victims to pay them. They need to sort of rebrand. They need to look less tiger and more sort of fluffy moggy. Someone who can look like your business partner or look like someone who you'd want to negotiate with and have some sort of interaction with. So a few years ago, all the ransomware groups pretty much went through a drastic rebrand to try and look a lot more accessible, I suppose. So here are some of the logos of the ransomware groups we've got on this pink one here, which is called Vice Society. They're a ransomware group who almost exclusively target the education sector. Their logo makes me laugh because you probably can't see it from the distance you're at, but it says ransomware with love. That's what they choose to do. So these are all ransomware groups. R-Evil is a very famous one. They've given interviews to journalists where they say they're in business, not war. They talk about how it's saturated as a scene. And then this ransomware group here, DarkSide, they have hit some really, really large companies. And what was quite entertaining in some respects about them was they turned around and they gave this interview where they said that going forward, 10% of every ransom that's paid, they will donate to charity. And at the end of that announcement, they said, no matter how bad you think our work is, we are pleased to know that we have changed someone's life. This is the world we live in. They give money back guarantees. If you're not satisfied with the service that they have provided you, they will give you your money back. They'll sign legal agreements with your GCs or your legal team to agree that they won't hack you again or whatever it is that they want you to do. They create these wonderful videos where they showcase their amazing logos. This is Medusa, who are another ransomware group, and they have got some pretty hilarious videos that I recommend you go look at. So how do they get away with all this? They've got a load of money. They're really successful at what they do. And people often come to me and they say, okay, you used to be in the police. Why can't you just trace the money? Why can't you just follow the money, and that will lead you to who the attackers are, and then everything's great? Well, the problem is that very much used to be the case with organized crime for a number of years. It was always difficult. In fact, Pablo Escobar's accountant once famously wrote that one of the biggest problems they had in the Medellin cartel was that they were stashing money in farmhouses and in fields and in attics. And the biggest problem they had was rats ate the money. And rats would eat billions of dollars each and every year because they couldn't clean the money fast enough to get it out. That's not really the case anymore. Now, criminals can use cryptocurrency to wash 10, 20, 30 million instantly, without trace, anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, from a law enforcement perspective and from a cybersecurity perspective, there's very little we can do about that. Very, very little. There's lots of things, and I won't go into this in this talk, lots of mechanisms they can use to use cryptocurrency platforms to wash large quantities of money, completely without trace. So that means you've got an organization that can't be traced by law enforcement, that has a high degree of skill, that can wash large quantities of money pretty much without concern, which creates quite a formidable adversary for a lot of us, considering I have yet to encounter an organization that has too much money and doesn't know what to do with it, too many resources and doesn't know what to do with it, which means that we're really stretched. The other thing we've seen, which is also, and I appreciate you've all come back from your lovely coffee, and I've just given you a whole load of really depressing, miserable news about crime, and it's really set the tone pretty low. But another thing that's happened that I think is quite interesting is for smaller companies, ransomware is a really big concern. But for probably the last year, there's been a kind of arrogance, I would say, amongst some of the really, really big companies that have sort of said, well, nah, we'd detect it, we'd stop it, they wouldn't get in. They wouldn't get in. And for the first time in history, what we're now seeing is that these ransomware groups have so much money, they can actually outbid nation states on the dark web to buy 0 days. 0 days are sort of something that nobody knows about, a kind of vulnerability, a way of exploiting something in some sort of platform that nobody yet knows about, no one's patched, no one's configured, no one's got any sort of anti-malware detection for. It's a complete guaranteed way in, essentially. And typically, nation states would be the ones who would buy and sell these things. But ransomware groups now have the money to compete in that marketplace, which has never happened before. And so you're starting to see a lot of very large companies becoming very concerned about the future of where this leads. They also have some pretty brazen business strategies. And one thing that happened a couple of weeks ago was they hit a company and they were trying to negotiate with this company to pay a ransom. And for whatever reason, the company just wasn't playing ball. And so what they decided to do was go to the SEC in America and report the cyber attack on this company to the SEC. They notified the regulators themselves to put more pressure on the business to get them to pay. And we're seeing this a lot. We're seeing a lot of them coming up with pretty innovative ways to put that gun to your head. This was probably my favorite one, though. So Lockbit are probably one of the biggest ransomware groups we have at the moment. They're very, very problematic, very, very highly skilled, excellent. And they launched a new product, Lockbit 3.0, which was their new big product that they were going to release. And they were thinking about ways that they were going to promote this and sort of gain some traction and some virality, I suppose, on social media. So what they did, and I don't know if you've ever heard of the brand Supreme. It's a kind of clothing, apparel brand. And Supreme does this amazing thing where they launch something new and they do a sort of drop. So like, I don't know, 1,000 tops or 1,000 shoes will be on sale and that's it. Everyone piles on, it goes crazy. And Lockbit thought, actually, this is a good idea. We should do something like this. So they announced that anyone who got tattooed with Lockbit's logo would receive $1,000. And they verified it. And what happened was, as you can see, all these people started tattooing Lockbit, the ransomware group's logo, onto their body in exchange for $1,000. So this is the sort of thing that we're seeing. And it's all a bit of a joke on some level, but it has really, really serious consequences. Obviously, apart from the fact that these particular people are now walking around with a ransomware group's logo on their body, but good for them, I suppose. They got their £1,000. So in my experience, that's the kind of ecosystem that we're operating in. These people, these groups are really sophisticated. They're really, really good at what they do. They're really good at getting paid. And organizations end up in a lot of trouble. So as I said, a lot of what I do is about preparing companies for that worst situation. And the one thing to remember is that if you get hit, the response and what you do and how you react and how you negotiate and what your strategy is all coming from humans. And the problem humans have, and we all have the same problem, is that we are absolutely appalling decision makers under pressure. Every single one of us. I'm an ice climber. This is me ice climbing in the Andes in the summer. And it's very similar in climbing. You're really great. Everything's going well. You're making brilliant decisions, safety-conscious decisions, until something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong, what I've noticed is all my decision-making, all of my experience, all of my knowledge about how to be safe in the mountains basically goes out the window, and I start panicking and start doing things that, looking back on it in a cool, calm, collected way, I think, oh my God, Lisa, what were you doing? And this is what I see in organizations. You get hit with a cyber attack, and I guarantee you it will be chaos. It always is chaos. It's always stressful. It's always just the worst possible situation your company can experience in many ways. And the only way to deal with that situation is to start planning for it, start preparing for it, and start rehearsing it. What are we going to do if we get hit with ransomware? What are we going to do if they steal our data? In what situations would we pay a ransom? Is there a situation? Who would need to sign that off within our organizations? How would we buy cryptocurrency as a company? Do we have cyber insurance? What happens if this platform goes down? What happens if that platform goes down? What's the impact to our customers? All of this stuff you can consider now. And if you do, you're in a much, much stronger position if you ever were to be hit by one of these groups. The people who end up having to pay are the people who don't have a plan, who haven't thought it through, and have to panic, and the only way out is to pay that ransom. So there's sort of 3 key lessons that I want you to take away, really. The first is know your threats to your business well, and all of us will be slightly different. Some people will be very much impacted by ransomware and will be high targets for that kind of double extortion, stealing the data type of thing. Other companies, you might operate, for example, in have some sort of connection to Ukraine, or you might have some connection to either Palestine or to Israel, which means you're a high risk of hacktivist activity. So groups that are going to take your website down, deface your website, things like that. So think about what your business is, what data it has, how it operates, what's your public profile look like. You can pretty much identify which groups might be interested in your company and which ones wouldn't. Have a plan and think about how you're going to keep things moving. So one of the things that I think is really imperative to take away from this is that if you imagine a situation where your business is taken offline by ransomware, and whatever it is that they are demanding, how can you keep some of those important business services moving? How can you still serve some of your customers? What manual workarounds can you do? To give you an example, I worked with a law firm recently, and we simulated this situation very similar to what I've depicted in this talk. And I said, okay, so what's your biggest problem if you have no IT? And they said, you know what it is? It will be filing court documents. Because for us, if we miss those court deadlines, that's game over for our client. There's no kind of talking around that. It's a sort of hard deadline. So they thought, okay, how would we do that manually? Well, we need a whole process for people to physically have printed documents, physically walk them to the court building and submit them. And we don't have that process. But again, you need to know this because there has to be these manual workarounds where you can do things over the phone or physically go and meet your customers and deal with things that way. What happens if you have no IT at all? And then rehearse. So come up with these plans, write these plans of what you're going to do, and then go and rehearse them. Because ultimately, and I've seen this so many times with organizations ranging from big aviation companies all the way down to smaller companies, they have these plans. The plans are beautiful. The plans look absolutely perfect. And then you rehearse the plan with the execs or with the technical teams, and it all falls apart. It doesn't work at all. So if you don't rehearse, I can guarantee you there are holes in your plan that you don't yet know about. And that's really, really important to identify. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it. Go and check out the ransomware groups. They're all on Twitter. They've got Instagrams. They've got YouTube channels. Go and read up on what they're doing. Look at their sites as well. They talk a lot about the organizations they're after, what they're doing, things like that. It's really important that you understand what their ecosystem is as well, and then hopefully you can be better prepared. Thank you very much.